Welcome to a presentation on an overview of a report that we've been working on the economics of the Cascadia Subduction Zone Earthquake in the Portland Metropolitan Region. We've completed this report recently, and it is available through the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization. I'm Sarah Reich. I'm a project manager at ECONorthwest, and I'm here with my colleague Adam Domanski, who's also with ECONorthwest. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Adam Domanski. I'm the senior economist, and with Sarah, we've been working on this project for quite a long while. And while the topic may itself be a little dark, the analysis on our end was it's very interesting and exciting. And then we also know it's just such an important topic for the region. So we're very excited to finish this report and share our findings with you today.
The study has been underway for a couple of years now. The economic study, the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization had the findings of another study done by Domanski that estimated physical damage in the Portland Metropolitan Region. And there were many people who wanted to understand how the physical damage might unfold into effects in the economy. And so that's what our study was intended to focus on, building on the previous research. We had several objectives with our study here. The first was just to estimate the economic disruption arising from a Cascadia Subduction Zone event in the Portland region. And you can see on the lower right-hand part of the screen, the region is highlighted. Those 5 counties is what we consider the Portland Metropolitan Region. The study was intended to also illustrate the sensitivity of the economy to different resilience interventions that the emergency response and disaster preparedness communities have been discussing as possible actions that we could take to minimize disruption after an event. So we looked at that, and then more broadly, we wanted to understand the distribution of the economic impacts on vulnerable populations and how those translate into equity issues associated with economic disruption and recovery. We know that always in economic studies, there's an element of understanding how the different economic impacts occur both in the aggregate, but also how they fall on different segments of the population or different segments of businesses. That was an important dimension of our work here. This slide lays out the study design and the elements of our work. Starting with that Domanski research, we merged the Domanski physical damage with economic information that is provided in the disaggregated from the state data, state economic data, and it's confidential information, confidential data, which provides business level economic information that we were able to merge with the actual business physical damage. And then all of the results that you see today are rolled up so that we protect that confidentiality, but we were able to actually merge on a site location basis the economic information with the physical damage information. We then developed a business resilience factor model that took into consideration that physical damage is only one element of a business's response and their ultimate impact from an economic perspective. And Adam will talk a little bit about that in more detail when he describes the findings of this first analysis. But what that ultimately ended up was an assessment of business disruption measured in terms of economic variables. We had a second element of the study that took, that building damage focused on residential houses and then took household information at the census block group level and combined that with an index from the CDC that tells us how vulnerable different populations are to natural and man-made disasters. And it combines data on a variety of different indicators that tell us how different populations the capacity of different populations to respond to shocks. And we put those together to understand how the the impacts of a Cascadia event would be felt differently throughout the population in the Portland metro area. We then did some work that is documented in detail in the report to look at how the larger economy might respond and particularly respond to different policy interventions. And you can read more about that in the report itself. The entire study was informed by a detailed review of the literature and was guided by a regional stakeholder work group, which we met with at numerous points during the course of our research over the last 2 years. And we really appreciate the guidance that they provided. This was a group made up of emergency managers from all of the jurisdictions in our study area. And they provided great feedback on and direction on the different assumptions that we used and the research process. And then finally, we spent quite a bit of time talking with 2 different groups. The first were utility managers and managers of transportation infrastructure and all of the other resources, public resources that we needed to better understand and understand how they would respond to an event, to understand the economic implications of the regional event. And so we had stakeholder interviews with those groups. And then we also talked with a number of representatives of the private sector and businesses throughout the metro area. So quickly, this study is a high-level look at how the Portland region's economy might respond to a Cascadia earthquake event. You can think of it as kind of a first pass into investigation into the high-level questions that people were asking, but there are many different areas that we might want to dive deeper into. And in fact, the stakeholder group has, and we have been continuing to think about ways that we can use the model we've developed and the research questions that have come up through this event, but we're out of scope here, and expand into new and different areas of analysis to better understand how the economy might respond in more detailed sectors and other aspects. So this is that first pass, the high level look at how the Portland region's economy will respond. It's an investigation into the relationship between economic disruption and social vulnerability, understanding the distribution of those economic impacts across populations. And it provides an integrated model of physical damage, business characteristics, and business response, which, as I said, lays the groundwork for future avenues of research. It is not a benefit cost analysis of a particular policy. It is not a set of recommendations for how to bolster economic resilience, though we provide clues and potential areas that might be investigated and could lead to recommendations from more detailed study. And it is not a study of the impacts at a multi-regional level. We have to assume, and we only look at the impacts that are occurring within the Portland region, understanding that the Cascadia event likely would affect regions up and down the throughout the Pacific Northwest, up and down the Pacific coast, including the Seattle and potentially down into California. It was too big of a task to attempt to model and integrate all of those potential effects in this model. So we are limiting it to the effects in the Portland region specifically. And I'm going to pass it over to Adam now. We have thoughts on this, and it will take you through the first of our findings.
Yeah, and let me just kind of emphasize that first bullet. So this is where economics really shines, and where economics is also known as the dismal science. And it's not just because we're evaluating a dismal event here that will be tragic on many, many levels. But what we're looking through in this study is specifically what are some things that policymakers can do now that are going to minimize the impacts or are going to shift the way the Portland economy lands after the event. I'll tell you right now that to really make the decision on where to invest that money and which policy to pursue, you need to know something about how much it's going to cost. And economics is a tool that's going to help you kind of prioritize and evaluate where those dollars should be spent and which policies should be enacted. We don't have the cost side of this. So we look at a URM scenario, we look at this utility infrastructure, we look at transportation infrastructure, and we tell the story about how important those are to the region and how failures in those areas, or at least mitigating failures in those particular elements, can help the region. But we don't know how much it's going to cost. So that is, Sarah talks about additional steps and next research. That's clearly one of those areas. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about what some of the study elements are and what the results are. We've got 4 major findings here that we're highlighting. The report is much more dense, and there's an even denser technical appendix. But let's kick it off with the key takeaway points. One is this CSZ event, this Cascadia Subduction Zone event, is going to disrupt business and economic activity in the Portland metro area. That doesn't sound like such a profound finding, because probably anybody could have guessed that. But what we do have is some very specific measures. So Sarah mentioned we have that business level data matched to building level impacts, and we know how many people work in those businesses that are in those buildings and how much they're paid. And so if we look at the response that businesses are going to have, we can see that about 70% of them are going to be disrupted or closed temporarily. That's 70% of all individual businesses across these 5 counties. On top of that, when you look at how many people those businesses employ, it's over 800,000 jobs. Now, ultimately, there's a question of how long these impacts are going to last. But even if those impacts only last 1 month, that totals over $4.3 billion in lost income. So it's substantial. Not just it's going to disrupt business, it's a substantial impact. And now, this zooming in, this is the map from the previous slide. This shows some of our spatially explicit analysis that we can do. Is we can look and see where are those jobs, where are they going to be impacted, and we have all these results in our study. Now, there's a lot of things that happen when you have an event like this. So clearly the ground shakes, buildings are harmed, people are harmed, businesses are harmed. But then there's a recovery period. And when you look at the broader literature of these massive disasters, you get these weird, seemingly counterintuitive results. And that's displayed in this graph right here, that immediately after the event, you have this amazing, incredible disruption. But then there is this green bar that shows up, and that green bar that shows up is federal disaster aid, it's private insurance payments, it's new public investment. And when you look at the net effect, you might have a long-term gain or a long-term loss. What our study is doing is focusing on that first slice. One thing that we can't predict is how much money is the federal government going to make available, how quickly it'll be available, what kind of resources constraints will be there, what will be available for or affect the timing of the recovery, and how will the region rebuild. That's just a long-term question. What we're looking at is that initial shock. And so we're valuing that red bar and then looking to see, are there ways that that red bar can be minimized? And in 2 degrees, it's really important, because 1, you're going to minimize this specific harm to individuals and businesses, which is important. And 2nd, you're going to minimize that reliance and importance of that green money, that green bar showing up at the end. And so even by mitigating the impacts in the beginning, you may set the region up for stronger long-term recovery. Now, I mentioned this odd counterintuitive result, but it turns out that that pile of money showing up after event produces long-term gains. So a lot of economics literature has looked at this, and they found that at a larger scale, over a longer time horizon, you do actually see gains in gross domestic product, a measure of economic growth, in the long term following disasters. Now, this doesn't mean that disasters are a good thing. On this one measure over the long term, you see these gains, and that really tells a story about having these resources, this coordinated effort to rebuild and structure, and the positive effects of that. But what it doesn't tell is those short-term impacts. It doesn't capture those distributional effects, how you're going to exacerbate differences. And some people are just going to do better. And the last thing that clearly any of this research shows is that these types of events are a good thing. They're not a good thing. They're a uniform bad. What these studies do show is the way that money shows up later on is critically important. And so kind of touching on that and extending on that, that notion of winners and losers persists. That even when you do have those scenarios with on a national GDP scale, you've got long-term gain, you might still exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. So people with the resources, businesses with the resources to respond are generally the ones that were doing better off beforehand. And the ones that individuals and businesses that can't respond were the ones that weren't doing as well beforehand. If you think of all the social and political issues that the Portland region is facing right now, the CSE event is not going to solve any of them. Housing affordability isn't going to be solved. Wealth inequality, access to resources isn't going to be solved. And you might have some other effects that are pervasive and long-term. You may have some out-migration. And even after all that government aid is absorbed, even if we did measure a 20-year time horizon that saw that Portland got a little bump, those distributional effects are likely going to persist. And so that's why just relying on that money showing up at the end isn't a solution. Really addressing the critical differences between how individuals respond after the event is really important. And anything that can be done before the event is also critically important.
And this is a great segue into our next finding. I'll make a couple of points here on this slide before I move into this. So there's been a lot of research, really interesting study into these the inequality of disaster recovery. And one of the interesting findings is that in a 15-year period following the an event, the overall populations gained wealth, but that finding was only true for white populations. And it found that non-white populations consistently lost wealth when you started looking at the subpopulation. So overall, it looked like people were doing better, but disaggregated, that was really a limited experience to many of those people who had resources already. Another example with the housing affordability issues, which we know is an issue here in the Portland region that we're facing right now, following the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand. Rents ended up increasing, and they had a similar situation with a very tight housing market, high rents already when the earthquake hit, and high housing prices. Well, after the event occurred, they lost a lot of the housing stock that was there, and the different responses to that ended up resulting in rents increasing by 40% in some neighborhoods. And that alone led to a certain amount of displacement and increasing inequality among property owners and tenants, or between property owners and tenants, and ultimately led to an erosion of wealth among those more vulnerable segments of population, particularly among renters. So there's a lot of really good research out there that's documented in our literature review section of the report that provides some dimension to these effects. And I'm going to move right into then our finding 2, which the literature overwhelmingly reinforces, that the Cascadia event would disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. It would further entrench existing social and economic disparities. And so we wanted to spend some time really understanding how the distribution of this effect, where this might be felt most prominently throughout the region. And we did that using, again, the physical impact damage that we looked at specifically at residential structures and places where people are living. And we combined that with a measure of social vulnerability, which the CDC has developed, called the Social Vulnerability Index. And this is designed to look at the vulnerability of populations to man-made and natural disasters and their capacity to respond and recover from them. So it's right on point to what we're doing. The index is made up of variables in 4 different categories. You've got socioeconomic status, household composition, and disability. minority status, and then housing and transportation, access to those things, and the characteristics of those things. This map shows those two parameters, the physical damage and the social vulnerability index, overlaid on top of each other. And the areas where you have high damage and a high vulnerability are the areas that we would be most concerned by. And those are indicated in the map by the dark purple. You can see concentrations in Washington County, in Multnomah County, up in Clark a little bit, and a small amount in Clackamas County. Areas where you're just seeing the pink or the oranges, that's areas where there's more damage but less vulnerability relative. And then areas where you're seeing a lot of blue but not a lot of those purple tones, those are areas where you just have a lot of vulnerability but less relative damage to the household units, the physical structures. We also looked at vulnerability along dimensions that are related to business ownership and where workers actually work. So this is apart from the social vulnerability index, but looking at detailed micro data that where we were able to look at the low-income workers and what industries they are primarily working in. And we found that they're concentrated in those industries that are more likely to be disrupted by an earthquake. So the accommodation and food services, retail and trade are two of the big ones that would experience the most disruption. And those are the areas also where disruption is, people are least able to adapt through that. As we've been working through COVID, we've had a much greater appreciation for how certain segments of the economy can adapt and work remotely, and to the extent that communications and other things are available eventually after an earthquake, a lot of sectors are probably in a better position, even than the data indicate here, to transition some of their work remotely and continue to operate even if the physical building is damaged or inaccessible. But we find that those sectors that are most able to do that are those that that don't overlap well with where most low-income workers end up getting their income from. So that would suggest that there are going to be disproportionate impacts on low-income workers from the event and the disruption that businesses would face. Similarly, this graph shows that the types of businesses that would be more likely to be disrupted, those would occur in the accommodation and food services. And we talked about retail trade. Those are have a higher than average minority ownership. So that bar on the far right shows the average minority business ownership in the Portland Metro region. But on average, higher shares of minorities own those businesses that are in sectors that would be more vulnerable to and less likely to recover quickly from a Cascadia earthquake. Adam, I'm going to pass this back to you for finding 3.
Yeah, so we've been talking about what can we do about it. The Cascadia Subduction Zone event isn't necessarily something that we know how to go and stop. But what we can do and what we've evaluated here in the study is what can we do to mitigate those impacts or minimize them in some way. And so we've identified 4 specific policy interventions that we're testing. And what we do is we take our model that looks at how businesses are going to respond to the specific physical disruption that they face, and let's modify it. Let's adjust the model in a way so that those outcomes on these measures aren't as dramatic. And I'll go through the 4 of them right now. So the first scenario is going to be reinforced utility infrastructure. So this is going to be water, sewer, electricity, and telecommunications. So we know that businesses rely on different degrees of all of these things. And what we're testing is saying, well, if we knew how to make all of our utility infrastructure resilient so that it would not be a factor in business level impacts after the event, businesses fare and how the region fare. The second one is transportation infrastructure. We know and love the Portland region for its hills and its waterways and its historic bridges over the Willamette and the Columbia River. But we also know that a lot of those bridges were built before engineers know what they know now about building seismically stable bridges and transportation infrastructure. There's a lot of people that commute every day across those bridges, a lot of goods that travel across those bridges every day. And so what we're evaluating is, what if we had a world in which those bridges would not fail? And there's different ways to implement it. There's retrofit of existing bridges. You could replace them. You could find different transportation mechanisms. We're not prescribing the actual solution. We're looking at, well, if we were able to come up with a world where those bridges will not fail, how would businesses respond? And the third is also something that people in Portland are very proud of, and that's go around downtown Portland, and the architecture is this beautiful masonry brick buildings that are historic that really give Portland its charm. The problem, again, just like the old bridges, is that they're not seismically stable or resilient, and a lot of them are subject to failure during an earthquake and certainly during a Cascadia Subduction Zone event. Again, there's a policy scenario. You can go through and retrofit these buildings to various different levels that will make them more stable to the point that they may save the lives and property of people inside. But the real problem with URMs isn't just the building and what's inside it, but when you have a tall URM, it can fall, and it can fall in many directions. And so it's not just going to impact itself, it's going to impact the buildings around it, even if those buildings are not URMs. Additionally, the building might not fall, but it may be very unstable following the event, in which case engineers are going to have to come in and either stabilize it or demolish the building. And during that time, there's going to be a cordon zone, an area around the building where people can't come and go, businesses can't operate. And again, even if all those buildings around it are modern, seismically resilient and stable buildings that won't collapse during the CSV event, or at least have a low probability of collapsing, they will be inaccessible because they're next to a URM. And so we are testing a policy that says not only do we strengthen the URM to protect the building itself, but by doing so, we're going to get rid of these cordon zones, and that may allow other businesses to recover. The fourth policy scenario we evaluate qualitatively, and that's this notion of a population exodus. So the combination of effects here may result in people leaving to go work or live in another area because the region hasn't implemented policies or hasn't been able to recover quickly enough. So we also take a glimpse and look at, well, what happens if we can minimize that population outmigration and keep it here? So one really neat thing about our analysis is our ability to really drill down and look at individual business patterns. And so what this map shows right here is the commuting patterns. We use the loads data. It's a survey of how people travel. And we've identified where people live and where they work and whether they cross a river. And right here you have the percent of people that travel across a river to their work, and this is by their place of employment. So not surprisingly, downtown Portland, you have a lot of people that end up crossing a river, and these people would be specifically affected by that transportation infrastructure. I mentioned our URM policy. Here's an example of how we implemented it. So this is an area of downtown Portland. All the red buildings are URMs, and then those orange circles are cordon zones. We identify these cordon zones to be 1.5 times the building height, and any building that it touched would be restricted in its ability to return to service, and that's going to affect both the residents, individuals, and businesses there. Across the region, there's nearly 3,000 URMs. but that's not the sole source of the impact. Again, it's that cordon zone where we've got over 5,000 buildings in cordon zones themselves. As expected, these are concentrated in Multnomah County in downtown Portland.
I just want to make a quick note here that this idea of the cordon zones really came out of the experience from Christchurch, where they had to establish a cordon zone around the entire downtown, and it really hampered economic recovery and the ability for those businesses within the downtown area to continue to operate. That is all documented in our report, and there's a lot of interesting research about that effect. So that's one of the reasons why this came forward in our research as an important area to explore.
And so this is one of the sections where we have quantitative results. When we compare the policy scenarios, it's that utility service one that looks really dramatic. And it is dramatic because their scenario is quite dramatic. We went from a world where in our baseline scenario, there's going to be a lot of disruption to electricity, to water, sewer, and telecommunications. And we've magically found a way to turn it off. And what this really does is emphasize the importance of those utilities on businesses. So being able to reduce that disruption to utility services is going to enable about 14,000 businesses to continue operating. That means not close, protect about 170,000 jobs, and within 1 month, save $781 million in income. So it's a broad-based scenario. It affects all the businesses in the region. And of course, the result is dramatic as well. The transportation networks one is also a dramatic and important result, that there are a lot of businesses that more so than others depend on on those commuting patterns and transportation across rivers. If we can shore up that infrastructure, that's 240 businesses that won't be disrupted, and about $17 million in income that'll be protected. And then our URM evaluation is both the evaluation of strengthening the URMs for the businesses located in them, but as well as the businesses located in those potential cordon zones. The overall impacts here are limited. Again, they're limited to where the URMs are. So region-wide, it's a small share of businesses, but again, it is most of downtown Portland, and there's about 530 businesses that will be protected and about $41.8 million in income that will be saved.
And
so go ahead, Sarah.
Adam, the transportation network scenario, that took into account the different businesses' capacity to shift to remote work to a certain extent by sector, correct?
That is correct. So in situations where we had if we didn't have firm-specific information, but we had aggregate information, we applied it. So one of those scenarios, and we had a figure of this earlier, is what share of businesses or employees by industry sector can work remotely. So we do account for that when we're evaluating the impacts of transportation networks. And so, I think that's something that everybody is starting to discover now, is to what extent they can or cannot work remotely during the COVID crisis. And so we're leveraging that information in our analysis here as well. If that were not the case, so for instance, we're at home being able to work remotely because we have electricity, water, and all of our other utilities here, what we're controlling for in this scenario is just the ability to commute. But as soon as you start stacking on several of these layers of impacts, meaning if we didn't have water, sewer, electricity at home, we would not be able to work remotely. And that's where that fourth scenario comes in, that retaining population. So when we've looked at other disasters, when other researchers have looked at other disasters, there is substantial outmigration that's occurring. This is true for earthquakes. It's true for massive hurricanes, Katrina, a major outmigration out of New Orleans, and that in itself has substantial effects. There's been research that suggests that broadly, you might see 12% loss. Other information shows in the Portland area, you might lose up to 40%. And so any policy that can make staying in the Portland metro area more possible, more feasible, is going to help retain that population and have ultimately downstream positive effects.
And I should point out that the 40% of Portlanders who responded to that, it wasn't clear if that was going to be a temporary departure or a permanent departure, but I think it can be assumed that at least a certain percentage of those would not come back. All right, so we'll take you through to the last finding here and we'll wrap up the presentation. This is just a global statement, kind of a conclusion of all of the work that we've presented so far, that actions taken now can lead to faster, broader, and more equitable economic recovery. We've talked about the importance of the availability of those lifeline services, and ultimately through the modeling, that exhibits a stronger influence on long-term viability of businesses than the direct physical damage to the business. They're both important, but there really is a strong rationale to focus on those lifeline services, broadly, lifeline services being the utilities, the transportation, communications, all of that. Another finding that emerged, particularly out of our conversations with the private sector and the focus groups we had with the public sector, was the importance of public-private cooperation and investment in social capital being the institutions and the rules and the relationships that bind people and businesses together and get things done. And so activities that result in routine collaborative planning among businesses and government and members of the community, those were brought forward from our stakeholders as really key to setting the stage for both efficient economic recovery, but also bringing in that equity piece, making sure that there are opportunities for small businesses, minority-owned businesses who really understand their community to plug in and help be part of the recovery, and capture more of the dollars coming in that we talked about in that first slide, where there will be resources coming in, depending on how those are distributed, also will help to map the path and the slope of recovery, and also help keep and retain people here in the metro area. So that kind of collaborative planning can pull together all of these threads that we've been mentioning, and again, kind of help to solidify a plan that would lead to that faster, broader, and more equitable recovery. And finally, I think it's clear through a lot of our findings that any policy that is being discussed right now really needs to acknowledge these equity implications, that the benefits and costs and economic impacts of recovery aren't distributed equally among populations, and careful consideration to how all of that happens after an event, but thinking about it before an event is important to lay the foundation for ensuring that recovery occurs in an equitable way. We'll leave you with this final graphic that illustrates what happens after an event and how the economy might respond in the presence of resilient policies, resilient preparation, or not a lot of that kind of preparation. And the red line on the left indicates the initial condition of the community, and you can imagine that carrying forward, and then the three lines on the right indicate possible future paths. And it is possible to end up in a high resilience situation better off after an event than you were before. And if you don't put in the effort, it's also possible to end up much worse off in the end. And so this is all suggestions for how our regional leaders in the disaster preparedness community, but also beyond in the business community and the public and private sectors, can pull this information into current efforts to plan for the Cascadia Subduction Zone Earthquake when it happens. I'm going to turn off screen sharing, and we will leave you with a few things. I wanted to thank our client, the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization, for collaborating with us on this research. It's really been an interesting couple of years, and we've learned a lot, and I think that they've learned a lot. Our regional stakeholder work group really worked tirelessly with us through many, many meetings and provided excellent insights into how an event would unfold and how they're thinking about recovery in lots of different dimensions. And those folks put in a lot of hours and really improved the scope of the research that we ultimately ended up with. And then finally, the stakeholders in the business community who are willing to sit down and talk with us about how to make this research useful in their own planning endeavors, and how the public sector can help to collaborate with them. So we'll leave you there. You can find the full report on the RDPO's website, and there's an executive summary there as well. And I want to say thanks to Adam as well for presenting with me on this.
Happy to.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.